So this is the last satsang of this 1 month series of satsangs, which included online broadcasts. So thanks for being part of it. The next opportunity is the 3-week retreat to be held in April in Western Australia. And yesterday someone asked a question about the process of delivering the teaching and whether there are other ways that it can be delivered, other ways that include more interactivity, maybe using modern techniques of learning. And I completely agree that that's possible, and in fact may be very effective. What I didn't mention is that, and I did say that I'm not designed to deliver that teaching, a teaching that includes interactivity, movement, NLP techniques, although I mentioned that this way of delivering a teaching that focuses on repetitiveness, focuses on delivering a framework that is holistic and covers all of the bases, answers all of the questions that come up within the scope of this search for happiness in daily living. It does work on a way, or in a way, that changes our deeply, deeply ingrained beliefs, changes things on a physiological level, if that's how beliefs and physiology are linked. And what I didn't mention is that there's something very special about satsang, something very special about us sitting still and being able to drop into a place that doesn't necessarily need to listen to all the words with our brain. There's an invitation in satsang that if it becomes too hard or feels like it's not appropriate to try and understand with the working mind, then there's the invitation to just listen with your body. There's a field that gets created in satsang that does much more work than the actual words themselves. The words are in a way infused with the energy from where they come. And so the concepts that are spoken about not from memory, not from having learnt them, but because they're a translation of what is lived. They're putting into concepts the experience, the way of living, the change, the shift. They're not concepts that describe some philosophy or philosophical ideal. So, in fact, what comes first is the change, and then the change is communicated. And that communication has a power in it. That's not a power that I deliver. What's very clear is that I sit here and I talk, and I've got no idea what's going to come out next. So the notion of partaking in satsang, especially something like a 3-week retreat, where there are 2 satsangs a day for 3 weeks, and on top of that, the capacity to, or the potential to live in community and do activities throughout the day that then allow the concepts to be observed in action, not after you've left a retreat, but while the retreat is happening. So given everyone here has heard the framework, what I'd like is for anyone to ask any questions or make comments about the concepts and their understanding of the concepts, Maybe any misunderstandings or questions would be very welcomed. And that tends to be a way in which the satsang unfolds to answer questions that not only you have, but that many people have. That's another way that satsang magic tends to work. We always find like that the words are addressing exactly what we have in mind.
Could you talk about the feeling that you don't belong to a place? You travel around, you come back home, but you just don't feel like you belong anywhere. And then you try to switch places to find belongingness, but then maybe places don't help.
Mm-hmm. In short, that feeling of being lost or out of place really comes because there's an inner sense of disconnection. And if we find that we find our own home inside, then the searching for a home and essentially looking for completeness out there in outcomes, which includes like when I find the perfect place to live, where I feel comfortable, then everything will be okay. And that drive is actually being driven because there is a self-image in place that is not a reflection of what we truly are in the heart, or if we want to be less esoteric than that, that the human being, when it knows itself without certain ideas about itself, when certain beliefs about who we are fall away, feels comfortable, feels at home. And so the idea, often we hear the ego needs to die. And actually, in this teaching we say, we are the ego. Everyone is an ego. We don't have an ego, we are an ego. And the most enlightened sage was an ego, or is an ego. So what does that mean? What it means, we have to reassess what these definitions are attached to these words. If the teaching says the ego doesn't die, we are the ego. You can't kill the ego, you can't kill yourself. So what is being referred to by ego in this case means the body-mind organism and the consciousness that functions through it as personal consciousness. So the human experience, that is the ego. And the ego isn't the problem. The being a person, being an individual, isn't the problem. The problem is the belief in personal doership and attachment to outcomes. That is essentially part of the ego when it's part of the body-mind organism's makeup. And life can bring about change such that those aspects of the ego get dissolved. And so then we are still an ego, but now without the belief in doership and attachment to outcomes. And that dissolving of the belief in personal doership essentially dissolves a mind-made separation. A separation that prevents us from recognizing that what flows through us, what inhabits the body, what uses the body as a vehicle, is this very mysterious consciousness. And when I say mysterious, it's mysterious, and yet it's intimate. It's what we are. So it's mysterious, and yet we couldn't be more familiar with it. We are it. And if this mystery is obscured, then we only know ourselves based on our idea of ourselves rather than something that we can rest in and be. And so what are these beliefs about who we are? Why are they there? And importantly, a lot of people will be able to attest to the fact that this uncomfortableness is not really, in experience, it's not really thought. It's a deeply ingrained feeling of uncomfortableness, of resistance to life, of depression or despair when that comes up, boredom. It's not like you can just turn off a thought and say, oh, that was a thought, let me stop thinking that. It's a feeling that pervades the body. And so where does it come from? And the answer is it comes from our experience of life, how life is related to. And when events happen in life, often sad events and traumatic events, the relationship to those events is a relationship from the attitude that has been put in place, an attitude of doership and attachment to outcome. That means that we feel defined by what happens in the flow of life, defined by what people do to us. And so if someone we love lets us down, if something drastic happens in life, then automatically the attitude to that event is going to come from our makeup, our design, and if that includes the beliefs in doership and attachment to outcome, then that event is going to seem like an attack on who I am. And that energy that comes up, that uncomfortableness that comes up, and the whole story about what this event means and what it means that this person did whatever they did, what it means about them, what it means about me, what it means about God. All of that's contained in the energy, in the uncomfortableness, the blame, the shame. And then the body eventually figures out it can do something with that feeling. And what it does is it creates distracting stories or finds ways of suppressing those feelings. So they don't actually get worked out. They don't get seen to be a way of seeing life that is not really in line with how life is. It isn't seen that the other isn't the doer and I'm not the doer, and that my completeness isn't dependent on the love of the other or the appreciation of the other, the respect of the other, the consideration of the other. It's not seen that that is not the case. What is felt is that I have been attacked and I am extremely hurt on a deep, deep level. And so that uncomfortableness gets locked away, gets suppressed. And essentially it becomes part of our makeup going forward on a very deep level. So it becomes part of the self-image that we have of ourselves. And it's that self-image that essentially meets life moment after moment after moment. It's that self-image that is traveling through life. And that self-image at its root feels uncomfortable. It feels uncomfortable with life and with the other. And so what that uncomfortableness is looking for is the end of the uncomfortableness. And it, out of the same mistake, says, the answer is going to be found in finding a place that I can fit into. I find a group of people that understand me. Then that's the answer. And you can see that that's not addressing the error that was put in place a long time ago, maybe in someone else's life. We're not really sure how the cosmic law works, whether all of the feelings and all of the events that are locked away, or attitudes to events that are locked away inside of us, maybe they don't all come from our own history. But regardless of whether they come from some other life and some other life event and some other attitude to a life event that ended up inside of us, or it got put in place when events were happening in the history of Roger, let's say, it doesn't really make a difference. The dynamic at the core of that suppressed energy, which is continually being added to every time that we relate to events in the same way in a new moment, if the attitude is the same, then that uncomfortableness arises, and that uncomfortableness is then suppressed in the same way as to do, and it becomes part of the self-image that continues to flow through life or move through life. And so this is why there are these deeply ingrained experiences of uncomfortableness that we're not in control of, so we don't create them. If we wake up feeling bitter towards life, or if we wake up feeling hopeless, that is just the energy that has been suppressed in the body permeating outward from its core. And then what is experienced is that energetic blueprint. And when I talk about energetic blueprint, the doership and attachment to outcome essentially take form and manifest in the form of guilt, blame and pride, worry, anxiety, expectation and attachment to outcome. So really what's locked away in the self-image is shame and hatred based on the guilt and the blame that was in our attitude at the time of these events, our attitude to ourself or our attitude to the other. And so it functions automatically. So when we function again that way, it's not our doing. It's not something that we stop and say, this is how I'm going to relate to this particular circumstance. This is how I'm going to blame that person for turning up 2 hours late. It's not like that. It's something that happens automatically. And so the answer to this is not an answer that we put in place. It's not something that we fix, but rather life fixes this by uprooting this energetic load that includes in it our idea about ourself that is not accurate. So the idea about ourself that is not accurate is the idea that I am primarily just a physical entity that thinks and has emotions, and that I am separate and independent, that I am the doer of everything that happens through me, and that my completeness, because I'm a physical entity, is obviously dependent on outcomes. That I get added to by outcomes and I get subtracted from by outcomes. That's the false self-image that we have of ourselves. And so the change is a change whereby life starts to get us to look deeper, to understand, at first even to understand intellectually what the problem is and what the dynamics of suffering are, and then awareness in the working mind that starts to understand these dynamics gets to see the dynamics in action. And as they're seen in action, we come to become experts at understanding what is actually happening. And as we become experts at understanding our attitude to life, our attitude which is either guilt, blame, pride, worry, or expectation. Sometimes we have a bit of all of them, but often we exhibit a predominance in one or two. So as we become more and more familiar of how we function, without taking it personally, understanding that it's a movement in life that is destined to happen that way in that particular moment. If it happens, it happened because of the makeup of the human being. And that we didn't put that makeup in place. We've essentially been grown by life to be exactly the way we are. And so the thinking that happens in a particular moment is a happening, not my doing. And so as we become an expert, we also become an expert at watching, witnessing all of these things happen. We witness a feeling of hunger arise in the body. We witness pleasure and pain being experienced in the body. We witness blame arising. Witnessing means to really see all of these things as a happening and not my doing. That's the disconnection that happens, a disconnection or a disidentification or a detachment from what is happening. The detachment is the recognizing that I'm not doing the thinking, that thinking is happening, and that what I am is that which is aware of all of this happening. And as this awareness, this witnessing of everything as a happening, as feelings arising in the body-mind organism, words arising in the body-mind organism, thoughts and emotions arising, as that happens more and more, and we become more and more expert at understanding the dynamics. Because what I mean by that is blame is based on the idea that the other that delivered pain to me, the other that functioned or acted a certain way, a way that delivered pain to me, is the doer. And if that's our attitude towards the other, we're forced to blame them and to hate them. So if the blame is witnessed, it might also be understood by the working mind that sees, yes, in the blame, there is the story that says they are the doer. Now this is very different to what a lot of the wisdom teachings are telling us, that life is a happening, life is a creation, life is all a play of consciousness. Everything is happening according to God's will, not your will. Thy will be done. Or in the Bhagavad Gita, Krishna says to Arjuna, when Arjuna says he can't fight against his friends and family and mentors and gurus, he says, you must fight, you are a warrior, and as time I have already killed them. So he's really saying that you're an instrument through which what has been already created as part of the story of life is going to happen. It's not your doing. You've been designed as a warrior in order to fight. It's life functioning through you, or Brahman. Everything is, all there is Brahman. It's all an arising in consciousness. And it's unfolding. It's happening. So just to conclude, as the as the ingrained beliefs get weaker and weaker because of this witnessing and this observation, the energy starts coming out in different ways, sometimes cathartic expressions, and sometimes just changes in our beliefs based on our observation. And then we start feeling at home. And as we feel at home, we realize, oh, I don't need to find a particular place that is my home. I'm at home. I'm at home because I recognize that what's at the core of the human being is the consciousness of Source, and that whenever I drop into that being, there is a completeness there. And if we find that we can't drop into being because the doer will say, okay, I just have to drop into being. If we can't drop into being and there's a frustration, just understand that it's not necessarily available in every moment, even though it's there. Destiny might include certain thinking patterns that get in the way. And to the extent that we can surrender to the fact that there is this uncomfortableness, there is this feeling of not being at home, as soon as there is an allowing that to be there without trying to change it, and the only way that it will be allowed without trying to change it, if there's a deep understanding, this is not my doing. I don't have a job to do. I don't have a task to do. My job is not to end this suffering. My job is to... Actually, you definitely don't have the job of surrendering. Surrendering happens when it's deeply recognized, I can't get rid of this uncomfortableness. I didn't put it in place, and it's not my job to do it. So I'm putting my tools down. And the uncomfortableness may well remain. This is not a little trick to get rid of the uncomfortableness. This is seeing things as they are, really understanding. I don't have the job of getting rid of the uncomfortableness. And then see what happens.
Who made the script for the movie, like The Story of Life?
The concept that's put forward in this teaching is that the script isn't something that God cognizes beforehand, but what's put forward here as the part of the framework is that there is an infinite creative potentiality, source at rest, before it turns into the story of life. And because it's infinite creative potentiality, the word potentiality is important. It means it has to actualize at some time. Otherwise it would be dead, not potential. So this absolute nothing, which is consciousness at rest before the manifestation, so the unmanifest, is this infinite creative potentiality. And so it just explodes into manifestation. It explodes into the story of life. And it doesn't need to premeditate it. It is creativity. So what it will become is creativeness. What it will become is a story, a creation that follows a certain creative plot. So just like if there was, at the analogies, if there's an absolute master of something, like an absolute master. So this is an imagination too, because we don't have absolute anythings in life. But if there was an absolute master, whatever that master produces would have to be an absolute masterpiece. And so this notion is that infinite creative potentiality, source at rest, explodes into manifestation. So it doesn't spit manifestation out of itself, but rather it becomes manifestation. It becomes the story of life from beginning to end. And what we're experiencing is the unfolding of the story from within the story. So we are part of the creation. The creation is actually designed to be a creation of time and space that is experienced from the perspective of a particular individual within the story of life. And what functions through the individual is the very consciousness of that source that turned into the story of life. So what is looking through our eyes, the consciousness that is aware of this experience, is in fact the very consciousness that is one with everything that is created. It's really not separate from it, not made of anything. What is experienced is not made of anything different from that which experiences it.
But where does the consciousness come from?
See, that's a question based on a presupposition of cause and effect being something absolute. So because this creation is a creation based on laws of cause and effect, in other words, a creation that is created to unfold as if cause and effect is real. So the story of life in each moment, we could say, is an event or an experience, and there is an apparent cause for this consequence. So whenever we investigate life, we find that there's a causal link between a cause and an effect. And so that means that we only understand life to be a causality. So the question, where does the consciousness come from, is a question based on an understanding of what the laws of the universe are. But it doesn't mean that those are absolute laws of the universe. Meaning that outside of the creation, the laws of cause and effect may not apply. And that's very hard for our brain to understand. Our brain only understands if there's an effect, there must be a cause. If something is here, it must have come from somewhere. You can't get something from nothing, for example. And so my answer is that that question may not apply, may not be valid when we're talking about where the source of the manifestation came from.
Something different, like what are your thoughts on like trust and hope in life?
Well, hope and trust, like a lot of things, depend on the deeply ingrained attitude in them. So if we have hope that actually has a certain attitude of feeling defined by what we hope for, if we have hope because the current situation feels hopeless, then that hope is a hope that is based on the idea that I need something that I don't have, based on the idea that something will complete me, and so in a sense it becomes a form of expectation and attachment to outcomes. Whereas if that expectation and attachment to outcomes has fallen away, we could still hope for something, but knowing that the outcome's not in my control, and knowing that whether the outcome is delivered or not is not so important. So at some point, hope is seen, even if it's the the initial type of hope that I'm speaking about, with expectation and attachment to outcome, it at some point serves a purpose. You can find that when the attachment to outcome and doership is really, really strong, that dynamic expresses itself in some people as hopelessness, a complete sense that there is no purpose in life. And so the movement where hope comes in can be a movement towards freedom. It's a movement whereby the beliefs in doership and attachment to outcome are getting weaker. But at some point, even that hope, which is, let's say, a step up from the hopelessness, is seen to be an expectation of something that ultimately isn't needed, because we usually are hoping for an outcome.
But I would hope that my attachment to outcomes and my belief in personal doership goes away.
Yeah. So if you hope for that, hopefully you're hoping for it in a way such that it doesn't become a strong insistence. Because if you are hoping for the end of suffering, and suffering arises, if your hope is too strong, you'll resist the suffering that arises. And that resistance is more suffering. So this is a very sort of key point, is that resistance, which is at the core of all of our uncomfortableness, comes to an end first by there being the end of resistance towards the resistance. So if we're hopeful that, or I'll stop using the word hope for a second, if the uncomfortableness at the core is going to end, and when we look at that uncomfortableness at the core, we find that it is a resistance to life, a resistance to circumstance. So as I was saying at the beginning, event happens and there is an attitudinal resistance to it, because it's taken to be an attack on who I am, and we hate the other and we hate ourselves sometimes, depending on what the circumstance is. So that is essentially a resistance to events being the way they are. And that gets locked away. So at the core of these energies, there is resistance to what is. And so if that's going to change, the change has to happen on our attitude, level of our attitude, and that attitude starts on the outside and moves inwards. So if we're going to hope for the suffering to change, which at its core has resistance in it, resistance to what is, first what needs to happen is that there needs to be the ending of resistance to the resistance, which is a surrender. Resistance to the resistance means that suffering comes up and we start to fix it. We start trying to fix it. Start trying to rationalize who to blame for this, or why we're not, why we can't just let it be. And a large part of that is this idea that it's not welcome in this moment, the idea that it's not meant to be here, and the idea that I am the doer and I have to get rid of it. And actually, as described here, when it's there, when it arises because it's part of destiny. It's destined for it to arise in the moment it arises. And so if this is understood, it means I didn't put it in place, and therefore I don't have to get rid of it, and it's a valid part of this moment. And so then there is the resistance, which is the suffering itself, and hopefully there is an allowance, an acceptance of that suffering in the moment.
But given that, like, I'm not the doer and that I'm basically not in control of what happens, it's like, it's a bit scary, because what if, like, I'm destined to just, like, suffer for the rest of my life?
You see, the notion I just put forward is that suffering at its core is resistance. So the thinking mind, the belief in doership, says exactly what you said. This is very scary. What if I'm destined to suffer my whole life? I'm not going to just surrender, because I might just suffer for the rest of my life. So what I'm going to do instead is I'm going to try my very hardest at fixing this, at resisting it, essentially. And so that is a continuation of the resistance that is at the core of the suffering, carrying on. So if the suffering is going to end, it's only going to end if the dynamic that is at the core of the suffering starts getting broken. And so don't worry about what might be, but recognize that resistance of your suffering is more resistance, and what is at the core of the suffering is resistance. So if this is understood, then resistance or suffering arises, which is in itself resistance, and to the extent that we don't resist that suffering, life has moved you in the positive direction. So the idea that this is terrible news, I might suffer for the rest of my life, is not recognizing the fact that the surrender to the suffering is a layer less suffering than you would have if you were resisting the suffering. So already, if you surrender, life is taking you in the direction that you're hoping for.
Don't you think that life is unfair, because a lot of people suffer for their whole lives?
Yes, life is not fair. At least from the human perspective. From an overall perspective, this story of life may be a story of complete balance. The notion of karma could be a notion that just describes one of the mechanisms that are included in the story of life. The story that started at the beginning and ends somewhere else. So karma might be part of the mechanism in this infinite creative creation that brings about perfect balance, which from that perspective means life is absolutely fair, life as a whole. But when we look at, when we draw a circle around a particular event and certain tragic circumstances, then in practical terms, I would say life isn't fair, and if we hope for life to be fair, we're setting ourselves up for disappointment. A disappointment on top of the disappointment that life isn't fair. What that means is that if life isn't fair, we are going to receive pain as well as pleasure, and sometimes that pain is disproportionate to the pleasure, and it's disproportionate to the person's way of living in life. Some people who deliver a lot of positive end up in very tragic circumstances. But all of that aside, what we can be thankful for, optimistic about, is that even if we're not the doer, that life has brought us to a place where new conditioning is being delivered, new conditioning that is the exact type of new conditioning that can undo the existing conditioning that creates suffering. And when that dynamic that is essentially attached to outcomes, when that dynamic falls away, we'll find that we're not so concerned about the fact that life is a duality, that life is pleasure sometimes and pain at others, that life is unfair. We find we're not so concerned about it. It's less relevant once the attachment to outcomes falls away, once the false idea of who we are falls away. And so this is real reason to be optimistic, to be hopeful, is to say, wow, I'm not the doer, and life has brought me to a point where I'm interested in this inquiry. I'm finding myself engaged in spiritual teachings, which is not what the average human being is interested in spending their time on. And we might find that not only are we engaging in these spiritual teachings, or more accurately, being pushed or lived through circumstance that includes spiritual teachings, but over time we see that our belief systems change, that our attitude to life changes, and that recognition can allow for a deeper optimism. And if we find that we're going through life still being exposed to spiritual teachings and there are changes that we can see, then the opportunity is at any moment for a shift to happen, a shift that sees why the resistance is continuing. Maybe sees that, the resistance, the uncomfortableness is continuing because that same dynamic of resisting is continually happening in my life in relation to the uncomfortableness I have inside. And so in that moment there's an opportunity, if it clicks, for the doer to surrender and say, that's it, I'm going to stop.
But yeah, being that life brought us here to basically figure out this big secret that we're not the doer, and this could be new conditioning that brings about the end of suffering. It's like winning the lottery. Do you think there is a meaning to it? Like, why us? It's like...
Well, Ramesh used to say that based on exactly what you've just described, that you could say that we're God's favorites in the story of life.
Do you think one should try to share this with as many people as possible?
I think what happens is there's an exuberance when we start to realize that there is information out there that tells us about a different way of seeing life, tells us that life is not what we think it is. And when we start engaging in that information and seeing positive change happening, then automatically we feel like we want to share this with everyone. This is actually part of the evolutionary nature of the human being, is that we actually want to see others happy too. It's an over-exuberance actually at first, because what happens is we assume that everyone will be able to hear or engage in the material in the same way you have or others have, such that it starts to be interesting and make a change. The reality is that everyone has their own destiny, and then not all going to be interested, or not only not interested, but not going to necessarily receive the pointers in the same way you did. And so it's over exuberant at first, because we, in a sense, insist on giving it out. And it ends up causing sometimes more friction than we expect. And so at that point, when that becomes apparent, we start to mellow a little bit in terms of who we share the information with and how we share the information with them. Sometimes it becomes, the conclusion is, actually this is a journey that is a journey of me moving inward, and what's most important first is to get this journey sorted, and then I'll see what happens in regards to the other. So it just becomes a natural refining based on our observation of our experience.
What happens when we die?
It's not really important to know that, because what we're really looking for is happiness for, in your case, Vilda, in this life.
But I'm afraid of death.
But you're afraid of death because we haven't recognized the existence of the human being right now. Once the core of the human being is recognized, what I mean by recognized is once the illusion of me as a doer falls away, the illusion that my happiness is to be found in outcomes falls away. What is revealed is the fact that I am right now. I exist. Not I exist on as a physical body alone, but there is a recognition of the consciousness that floods through the body in each moment. Resting in being, resting in the isness, the I amness, that is essentially, you could say, prior to experience. And that resting in that I amness is something that is only available outside of the spectrum of thinking. So if there is a complete identification with our thoughts, and the doer principle is essentially a belief in doership that is always trying to think about what the solution is, think about who I am and what the past means and what the future means, think about what I am is. So the actual core of the human is outside of that thinking. If we hear this and we come and we realize, well, I'm always thinking, trying to find a solution. There's a commentary in my head all the time. Commentary about life, commentary. And that's the problem. That this being, this field of being, isn't to be found in that commentary. The commentary is actually the place it won't be found. Never. It doesn't matter how hard the commentary works, it won't find it. So the most effective part of that commentary is to recognize, I have to stop. And in that moment where the commentary recognizes itself as being there all the time, where there's a recognition that I am identified with the commentary and thinking that I am the commentary, which is really, this is identification with being, thought, and not knowing myself prior to thought. In that moment, a stop can happen and a recognition, and the recognition is not, I put it into words, I say, a recognition, here I am, prior to thinking. But the words are essentially more thought. It's about stop. And then you are, and you know you are because you are. So you are being. And that's the aspect of the human that is unknown, unappreciated. And so we're only afraid of death because we're not in contact with that aspect of ourselves. And someone would say, well, but if I'm in contact with that aspect of myself, that doesn't prevent me from being injured and then dying. And so I'm worried about what happens when I die. I'm worried about dying. And once again, that would be a question or a statement coming from the thinking. Because in the moment when you drop into being, the fear of death, the question about what happens after death falls away. It becomes irrelevant. Not because we're not going to die, but because in this being, the fact that I am right now is enough. Not enough to the thinking mind, but in itself, it's like, oh, here I am. And someone says, so what about when you die? And you go, no, I am. Here I am. It becomes an irrelevant topic. So the only reason we're afraid of death or want to know what's after death is not because we're afraid of what we will lose when we die, or because we're afraid of the uncertainty. The only reason we have those fears are because we haven't rested in our own being. And our own being is this aspect of ourself which is prior to the thinking mind, outside of the thinking mind. And the thinking mind is, guess what? The thinking mind is made up of these beliefs in personal doership and the belief that my happiness, my completeness is to be found in outcomes. So all of the resistance to life happens in the thinking mind. All of the questions about life happen in the thinking mind. And so it's the thinking mind weakening, or at least us dropping outside of the thinking mind from time to time and coming to know, there is this field of being, this place that I can call the core of the human being, the core of the ego. The core of the ego is here all the time. And it's not something I will ever be able to think about, it's only something I can be. That's why the talks say, what are we really looking for in life? Let's be clear about that. If we're going to seek, we hear all sorts of things, all sorts of concepts about life, what happens after death, where the universe came from, whether there are other dimensions, whether we have chakras, or all sorts of things that we can become interested in. Lots of interesting topics. If we find ourselves seeking, it makes sense that we ask a very important question. What am I really looking for in practical terms? If you come up with that answer, and the answer that's suggested here is, I'm looking for happiness in daily living. Happiness for Roger in daily living. Happiness for Vilda. And then it turns out that that's not as selfish as it sounds. Happiness doesn't mean we then become irresponsible or selfish. Our happiness is something we want to share. But that's beside the point. At first, it's actually, to be honest, I just want to be happy in this life. We might not realize it at first because the uncomfortableness, the unhappiness has told us that we want all sorts of things, that we want to find the perfect home, that we want to find a lover or a soulmate, that we want to find our purpose in life. We need to create something, we need to contribute. These are all the things that we want to find truth. These are all things that the suffering has told us that we're looking for. And the suggestion here is, let's be practical. Let's let go of any concepts that someone has told us. Let's let go of the concept that the suffering has told us that we're looking for. And when we do that, and we become really practical, I said, yeah, actually it's true, I just want to be happy. I don't need to put any other restrictions on what. Let me just say, I actually just want to be happy. And from there, we get to investigate what our unhappiness is, and listen to concepts that tell us what our happiness is. And here we get to know for ourselves, we get to feel what our unhappiness is. It's a certain set of feelings, relationship to life, an uncomfortableness with oneself and with life. That's our unhappiness. And when we look at that, it's guilt, blame, pride, worry, and expectation, based on these two belief systems of personal doership and attachment to outcome. And the pointer says your happiness is simply the end of your unhappiness. And what is key is to see that your unhappiness is based on the belief in personal doership and the belief that you require outcomes in order to be complete. The pointers say that is an error. It's not true. Thankfully, it's an error. If it was true, then we might as well hang up our boots and say happiness isn't available, because the fact is that we're not going to get the outcomes that we want in each moment. Life is going to be as it is going to be, out of our control. So the fact that these are errors, we are not the doers, the other is not the doer, and our happiness isn't to be found in the flow of life, is something to be very thankful for. It means that the uncomfortableness, our unhappiness, stems from an error. So if life corrects the error, then the suffering comes to an end. So what we're looking for is the end of suffering. Enlightenment is the end of suffering. That's what the Buddha said. And the cause of suffering is attachment. Attachment to outcomes. So, what's one of the key principles if this is going to end? We really have to surrender. We really have to see, I'm not the doer. Now, how does that seeing happen if we're not the doer? It's not your doing. It's not. I'm not telling you, I'm not giving you a prescription. See that you're not the doer. It sounds like a prescription. But whatever is said here is never a prescription. It's always a description of what might happen. What might happen is that the concepts that are being put forward here become part of your up-to-date conditioning, and at some point a thought arises, I simply cannot be the doer. The thought arises because life has been seen over and over from the new conditioning that in each moment you function one way according to your makeup. And then at some moment this thought arises after having seen this over and over again. I simply cannot be the doer. And that thought is not your doing. Similarly, the thought might arise, my happiness isn't to be found in outcomes. One day the thought just arises. I mean, when I say the thought arises in a profound way, I'm not the doer and my happiness isn't to be found in outcomes. Why does it arise? Because the investigation based on our new conditioning has been happening. The investigation, aided by the pointers, tells us you've received more than enough pleasure in life. And having received pleasure, being in a situation where your circumstance is at least at times quite good, you still find that this happiness isn't there. So we get to put a tick next to it. My happiness isn't to be found in outcomes. I've got the outcomes I'm looking for. And those outcomes that I haven't got, hopefully we can realize, actually that's just going to be more pleasure. I've got other outcomes that we can call pleasure, and those other outcomes didn't deliver the happiness I was looking for. And so the outcomes I haven't got, that I'm still waiting for, actually are just more pleasure. I've seen my happiness isn't to be found in outcomes, so you can put ticks next to it. And to the extent that you find yourself able to fall back into this place of being, and you fall back and you find, I'm at peace even with circumstance being unfortunate from time to time. So the more often that you find yourself blaming based on circumstance, let's say, and then you drop into being, And instantaneously the peace is there. The story of blame falls away, and it becomes clearly recognized, my happiness is not dependent on negative circumstances stopping. My happiness is available, my resting in being, my peace of mind is available, even when circumstance is painful. So at some point we have this epiphany. My happiness is not to be found in circumstance. My happiness is the core of who I am, and resting in that is where I find my contentment.
Could you say something more on fear, like for example fear of getting raped, or like that someone you love die?
Mm-hmm. It's that fear, which is a fear of something that might happen in the future, fits into the category of worry and anxiety. It is based on the notion that my completeness, my happiness, is to be found in outcomes being a particular way. So when we're convinced that outcomes need to be a particular way, the mind will come up with all sorts of anticipations of how life could turn out, which are actually correct. Life can turn out in any number of ways. And so the mind then starts worrying about the infinite number of negative things that can happen, visualizing those things happening, and then at a certain level feeling like that would be a complete attack on who I am. And so that's what worry and anxiety is, based on the deeply ingrained belief that my completeness is to be found in outcomes. So a biological fear is different to what I've just described as psychological fear. And the biological fear is different. So in a particular situation, when faced with a dog, let's say, that's aggressive, that aggressive dog in the situation can create a biological fear. Now that biological fear is not the worry and anxiety. That is a fear that makes sense given this biological circumstance, given the flow of life. So to expect biological fear to end is to expect something that isn't needed. We don't need biological fear to end in order to be happy. And remember, happiness, according to the descriptions here, simply means peace of mind. So when I say we're looking for happiness in life, we have to be clear what we're looking for is not some feeling of excitement or feeling of joy, but rather it's the absence of suffering and the revelation of what I am at my core, which isn't something, it's very profound, but in terms of how it is felt, it's best described in its negative form. It's much better to describe it as the absence of some suffering rather than the presence of something. When we feel fulfilled and complete and we dive in to try and find what this feeling is linked to, what circumstance it's linked to, we find we can't find a connection to a circumstance. And then it becomes apparent, this subtle feeling of being at peace is what I am. It's a causeless peace. It's not affected. It's not a result of something that's happening. So the biological fear, when it arises, is not something that disturbs our peace of mind, not something that disturbs our happiness, as long as it's seen to be part of destiny, part of the flow of life, pleasure or pain. And in the case of fear, it's usually what we would classify as pain. So it's pain in the moment, and knowing that the flow of life is always pleasure and pain, and that my completeness is not to be found in the flow of life. My completeness is not determined by what happens in the flow of life. We can allow the biological pain to be there. We can allow the circumstance to, on an attitudinal level, we can allow the circumstance to be as it is. biologically, if someone attacks us, we're going to do any number of things. We might freeze, we might scream, we might fight back. And whichever of those happens is all biological. One's not better than the other. Well, one might be better. Fighting back might be better. It might not. It might end up creating a worse situation. The point here is that whatever happens in the flow of life is a biological reaction. So the person that runs away, or the person that freezes, or the person that screams, the person that fights back, each one is doing what they are designed to do. The outcome, not in our control. So that biological movement can be witnessed as part of the flow of life, and once it's finished, the story about what it means is not there. But with the attitude of doership and attachment to outcome, the flow of life is attached to, identified with as my doing, identified with as something that attacks who I am or adds to who I am, and so then we have a commentary about whether it should or shouldn't have happened, in the form of usually guilt, blame, pride, worry, anxiety. And that story can carry on horizontally in time for a long, long time. That story can be there for a whole lifetime in relation to an event that happened. So if you take something like a sexual assault, and I'm not trying to minimize the pain, the significance of that as a painful event, an unfortunate, tragic event. The fact is that assault is part of the flow of life. It's at worst pain, right? And I don't mean just pain on a physical level, it's emotional pain as well. And the flow of life is always either pleasure or pain. And the question of whether it gets turned into suffering is a matter of what our attitude to life is, attitude to the flow of life, and that attitude is dependent on whether the deeply ingrained beliefs of doership and attachment to outcome are in place. So if someone is assaulted, sexually assaulted, and it turns into suffering, that is an inevitability. It's not something that they are failing at, it's not something they're doing wrong. It makes complete sense that if a very extreme event like that happens, and the self-image of oneself is that I am, at my core, added to or subtracted to by circumstance, then the suffering has to be there. And if someone knows themselves beyond the physical, or not limited to the physical, then what will happen is a situation like that will happen. It will not be pleasant at all. It will be just as painful. And yet, after the event, the relationship to what has happened in the past may well be very different, based on having a very different attitude to the flow of life. But once again, whether we have this attachment to outcomes, this what's being described as a false self-image, false idea of who we are or not, is part of the story of life. So it seems like this story of life is a story of time and space, a story of identification with a body-mind organism, whereby that sometimes or often it seems like that identification becomes one-sided, such that we forget what we are at our core. That forgetting turns into suffering. And then at some point in the story of life, there is a remembering of who we are, preceded by seeking. And once the remembering has become stabilized, then there is the end of suffering. So we could say that's what this is, a story of time and space, a story of forgetting oneself, a story of suffering as a result, a story of remembering, and a story of suffering coming to an end. We could also say that life is a story of a whole lot of other things, a story of evolution, a story of duality. An unfair story. The good news, this is actually, we talk about suffering a lot, and so that can sort of seem like a bit of a downer. But really what we're talking about is the end of suffering. What we're talking about is the potential of suffering coming to an end. We talk about suffering being an error based on a previously ingrained error. So it's actually very uplifting. I'll talk a little bit about the working mind and the thinking mind, because so far I've been talking about how and emphasizing it's not your doing, it's not my doing. And if we don't understand the way that the working mind and the thinking mind work in principle, we won't understand how change happens without it being my doing. So the human being is a result of their genes and up-to-date conditioning. The genes are the genetic makeup of the human. So when the egg and the sperm come together, that's the genetic structure, and a growth starts happening. And the human grows and continues to grow genetically and have a genetic structure. And at the same time as that growing, there are inputs from the external environment. And once the brain has formed and starts functioning, the external influences, which we can call new conditioning in each moment, bring about changes to what we can call our up-to-date conditioning. So up-to-date conditioning is the cumulative effect of all of the conditioning life has delivered up to that point in time. And so in each moment, life delivers new conditioning, and that new conditioning has the capacity to add to our existing up-to-date conditioning or radically change our up-to-date conditioning. And that new conditioning is changing who we are on a biological and psychological level all the time. And so the working mind is what is described as the functional part of the brain, or functional part of the thinking that is required in daily living to work out mathematics, language, understands how to drive a car and walk. So the working mind is the functional aspect of the mind. It's the aspect of the mind that produces functional thoughts. And the working mind doesn't cause any problem to our peace of mind. So we don't require the working mind to stop functioning. The working mind is based on the up-to-date conditioning that life has delivered that allowed us to understand mathematics and language. The thinking mind is also based on conditioning, and it's been put in place by the conditioning that came in from life that convinced us that we are the doer and that my completeness is to be found in outcomes. The conditioning we receive gets put in place by the family we're born into, the school that we go to, the political stance of the country we're in, the culture. All sorts of things in life add to our conditioning. And some of that conditioning is conditioning of the thinking mind. The belief I am the doer and that my happiness is to be found in outcomes. The very fact that we experience life in a way that feels like I'm the doer is a very large part of the new conditioning that is effectively there moment after moment after moment, that says, I feel like I'm the doer, so I must be the doer. I feel like, at best in life, I can get pleasure, and at worst, pain. So that becomes new conditioning, moment after moment after moment, that forms the beliefs in the thinking mind. That I'm the doer, and my happiness is to be found in outcomes. We didn't create them. And that's why listening to a talk, watching YouTube, reading a book, observing life is all new conditioning. And as we receive this new conditioning, our up-to-date conditioning is changing. And if the new conditioning changes the conditioning in the thinking mind, such that it dissolves, such that it no longer is seen to be true or accurate, then what has happened is that life has brought about a change in the conditioning, a change in the thinking mind. The working mind still has its conditioning in it. The change in the thinking mind often comes about by the functioning of the working mind. The new conditioning here is being given to the working mind. The working mind understands intellectually, my happiness is not to be found in outcomes. That's what Roger said. The working mind hears that and says, the concept that Ramesh put forward, that Roger's putting forward, says, my happiness isn't to be found in outcomes. That will never give you happiness. So the working mind understands this. It's not you as a doer that understands this. The concept has come in, it's affected, it's been received by the brain, processed. The brain is a machine. It processes however it's designed to process it. And then the working mind either understands the concept or it doesn't understand the concept. Once the working mind has understood the concept, it's become part of its makeup, we walk through life and the working mind starts functioning like it always does. It says, that's pain in the moment, that's pleasure in the moment. My happiness is not to be found in pleasure or pain. Suffering arises because of certain pain in the moment. And the working mind sees, that's suffering. And the core of the suffering is attachment to outcome, attachment to the idea, or attachment to pleasure. And the working mind sees all of this. And so that thinking continually happens. And we, with this belief in personal doership, assume I am doing the thinking. I am the one that is producing all of these thoughts that say, this is pleasure in the moment, this is pain in the moment. Actually, what's producing the thoughts is a machine that has been conditioned by life to then function a particular way. So what it means you're not the doer means that you'll find yourself in life, you'll find yourself being on a biological and psychological level changed by life. And then you'll find yourself functioning according to your makeup. So in each moment, whatever you think, say, do, feel, is a happening according to your genes and up-to-date conditioning. With this perspective, the other is no longer seen as an enemy. The other is no longer seen as a competitor or a rival, but rather seen as part of the story of life, just like we are. That life is unfolding and that each of the characters in the story of life have a destiny. And so if the other does something to hurt you, with this understanding, with this view of life, it's understood that it's my destiny to receive pain in this moment, and it's the destiny of the other to function a particular way in order to deliver the pain that I was destined to receive. It's not personal. It will still be painful. But the pain won't be added to with a load of guilt and shame, blame and hatred, attachment to outcome. Have you got something to add?
I can really feel also understand the whole system you have explained to me. But on the other side, I'm just reading a book from a psychotherapist, and this is also he has also something what I deeply agree. He's saying, for example, that we are responsible for our own life. That means, for example, when we are in a bad relationship, we are also, it's not to blame the other one, but if I stay in this relationship, I'm responsible for that. I cannot blame the other one. I have spent 10 years with you in this relationship, and it was my responsibility on a special way. Yeah, mm-hmm. And also he's saying that we can create a co-engaged relationship. That means I am, for example, I commit to myself. I will do everything that we both have joy and like this. And another example, I commit to myself, I will do everything in life to develop myself, that I make it conscious for me. The thought behind is that I have a little bit freedom to do something. That is my inside is all this. And today I was also in the ashram, and when Varesh says, I believe that we can create a beautiful life. That is fitting to me. Yeah.
Yeah.
But the other thing I also understand, because what I experience in my own life, what I from my family and my brothers and sisters, and I can feel that the pain inside is from this conditioning also. That is also for me. Yeah, I can understand and feel it. It's not here; it is here.
Yeah.
And I also can feel that I can rest in myself, but also there's pain, and I cannot do anything. I cannot stop the pain sometimes. It's coming and going and like this.
Yeah, so this is a very good point, because there is a paradox in life. And so whatever is put forward is a concept, and every concept has its counter-concept. And so a teaching is there essentially to undo the errors, but there can be many different errors. So some, when we talk about non-doership, if you say that you can't blame the other in a relationship, that doesn't serve a purpose. You can discern that the other functions in a way that delivers pain, let's say. The other functions in a way that is not your preference. That is not blaming them, that is discerning whether you're suited to be in each other. But blaming the other doesn't serve a positive purpose. We think that blaming the other will get them to change. The truth of the matter is that in each moment they're functioning according to their makeup, and blame is unlikely to change their makeup. Then if we look at what is put forward is that, but you have to take responsibility for yourself. Now, that's a useful concept, because we sometimes will find ourselves frozen in a situation, unable to make change. And so that concept that was being put forward is actually not talking about you as a doer, but rather it's putting forward new conditioning that says, get up, stand up. If change is going to happen, it's going to happen through you, through your action. And if someone reads that and then says, yes, I'm the one that has to stand up, I'm the one that has to leave, or I'm the one that has to put certain rules in place. If they do that, they're doing it because life has delivered new conditioning that has changed their up-to-date conditioning in such a way that says, I'm the one that has to function. Now, if that is delivered alongside the conditioning that says you're not the doer, and yet life will function and life will unfold by you in each moment doing exactly what you think or feel to do. Now we're starting to see the paradox is that what happens through you in each moment is a result of your genes and up-to-date conditioning that in theory you're not in control of. And yet we can't deny that in each moment I have the feeling of free will, that life, even though I'm not the doer, still happens by me leaving, opening the door and walking through it to go to the shops or whatever. And so the best situation is where we become conditioned in a way that we realize in each moment I am free to do exactly what I think or feel to do. Understanding that doing, that happening, is not my doing as a separate independent entity. And yet in the moment, life, I have to live as if I have free will. In fact, we can say you do have free will in the moment. From your own experience, you have free will to do exactly what you think or feel in the moment, with the deep understanding that what is called your free will is actually God's will. And if we hold those two together and we see, I do have free will in the moment, which is this feeling that I can move to the left or to the right. That's undeniable that we have this feeling. And it's a gift. It's the gift of free will. So then we can come to see, God's will and my will are not two. God's will and my free will are not two. Which is where this saying, trust in God, but tie up your camel. So what's saying, trust in God, but lock your front door. So there's a little joke. There was a big flood somewhere, and as the water was rising, a big truck came past and said, "Come on, we've got to go." And the man said, "No, I'm going to stay. I trust in God." And then the water got a bit higher, and a boat came past, and this man was on his balcony and said, "Come on, we've got to go." He said, "No, I trust in God." The water got even higher, and he was on the roof of his house, and a helicopter came and put down a thing and said, "Come on, we've got to go." And he goes, "No, I'm trusting in God." And then he drowned, and he went up to heaven, and he met God, and God said, "What was going on?" And he said, "Well, I was trusting in you." And God said, "Well, I sent you a truck, and then I sent you a boat, and then I sent you a helicopter. What more do you want?" So it means you are the one that has to function. Because if we take it too one-sidedly and say, I'm the one in control, I have responsibility, if we take it that way, then what happens is when you find yourself looking back in the relationship and seeing that you did stay there for 10 years, then you might say, I was responsible. So it was my fault that I stayed in the relationship for 10 years. And then that would be shame. That's what shame is. So it's this paradox is we don't want to say that I have complete control, but we do have to say, but I'm the one that has to function in life. I'm the one that has to do things. So to hear the concept and find ourselves becoming complacent or irresponsible or lazy can happen. It happens when the concept is understood on a one-sided level. And then we end up in heaven having to explain to God why we didn't do something. We don't really, because God will understand that's based on our makeup, right? So the conditioning comes in and says, it gives you the second half. You're the one that has to stand up.
With the sentence, I trust in God, that is not for me.
Mm-hmm.
I could explain why, but it's, for me there's no God.
Yeah.
And not a person also, I don't know what it is, but with I trust in God and it's God's will.
Mm-hmm.
This,
So
I cannot explain in English.
But the other way is you can change the word God to consciousness or source or life. What it really means is I trust in life. Not I trust that life is going to deliver pleasure, but really it means that I trust that life is going to make things happen. Yeah. But it's the same thing. It's just putting a different definition on the word God. Because what happens is we get given a definition through religion, and then we think that whenever the word God is mentioned, it's the same God that religion talks about, or that a particular person talks about. So for me, when I use the word God, God means energy in motion. potential energy has turned into energy and movement, all of life. So life is God. God is life. So it's not a God that is out there, it's not a person, it's a very impersonal movement of life. And so on the one hand we have to say, I trust that life has its momentum, and I'm part of that momentum. And at the same time as trusting in life, life unfolds by the individual that hopefully understands they're not separate from life, they're part of that movement of life. By me saying I'm the one that has to make a decision. And then even understand once I make a decision, that decision is not entirely my decision as my doing as an individual separate entity, but rather a happening. The decision happened. It's the paradox is very important for us to see, otherwise, and concepts don't deliver paradox on their own. Concepts can only deliver a paradox when they're part of a complete framework. That when we listen to the framework, we see, it's saying one thing here and then another thing there. So if we hear the concepts out of context, then, if someone sees a single quote, some quotes can be, they're 10 words long, so they can't really provide a complete context. So a quote that is inspirational to one person could easily be picked up by someone else and said, this is nonsense. Because usually a quote that someone has said is part of a complete teaching, and it's been extracted and put onto a piece of paper, and here's a quote. When it's seen in context of the whole teaching, then we can say, actually, now I get a feel for what's really being pointed at. Thank you.